Hi, everyone.
Hello. We wanted to continue through the book of Revelation, this time using some material we developed, actually a sermon that I put together for our United Church some 15 or so years ago. After we had been in the church at that point for 10 or more years, I think it was when Max was a little guy, we decided to dive into Revelation 2 and 3 with our church. So we want to read that sermon, the intro to that sermon today, and we've fleshed it out since. And the reason we fleshed it out is because this audience, the sermon audience, was United Church, a so-called liberal church. A lot of our conservative friends, almost all of them, went to conservative churches, and they didn't understand why we stuck it out in a so-called liberal church. So, but this was aimed at that liberal church. That audience needed a different point of view on our journey from a totally controlling environment, the Watchtower, to this liberal environment. And we had to kind of preface the whole thing with a confession, not my confession. So it's in my words, although Vivian's going to help us read it. Okay. And the theme of it is strengthen the things that remain, because if there's one takeaway we did take away from Revelation 2 and 3 when we first studied the book of Revelation together, not long after leaving the Watchtower, it was this principle. This is the opposite of what we had learned from our Watchtower background. You went to the church not of your choice, but not of Christ's choice, but really the one that suited you the best. So we'll get into that in the message.
And you expected perfection.
Yeah, something as close to perfection as you could get. So if you see us glancing off to the side here, it's because we don't have a hard copy of this. So we have to follow our TV screen. So that's the reason we're looking off to your right during the presentation of this. So I think the rest takes care of itself, keeping in mind this is a sermon that was given to a liberal church some 15 or more years ago. A confession I started out. When in 1993 Vivian and I first moved to Streetsville, the last place we would have chosen to worship and fellowship would have been Streetsville United Church, even though we had no car at the time, and Streetsville United was a 5-minute walk, one of 5 churches within walking distance of where we were living in Mississauga. What we had heard about the United Church of Canada hardly recommended Streetsville United to people like us, whose exposure to Christianity so far, 5 years removed from the Watchtower, consisted of periodic attendance at several stalwart conservative churches, Brethren, Baptist, and Presbyterian. The reputation of the United Church as a theologically radical institution would have kept us far away.
But there was a yet more important factor. We were victims of a condition some diagnose as supermarket spirituality, the perfect church syndrome. If you don't like the product, pick another. This was the common view of the evangelical Christians we had met, and most of them, despite or perhaps because of their considerable zeal for the Lord, lacked deep roots in either tradition or local church fellowship. But something happened in the winter of 1992-93 which caused us to ask ourselves a question. How often is our choice of church fellowship governed by the spirit of the world, namely the modern world's governing principle: minimize pain and discomfort, maximize pleasure and convenience? When Christians have deeply drunk of this spirit, they may well reason, if you don't like what your church is doing, move on.
Our media bombard us with this seductive message. Happiness is having what you don't have, which amounts to thou shalt covet. This grass is greener mentality generates in Christians the attitude which asks first, what can this church do for me and mine? We are frequently reminded, even by the very same media, that John F. Kennedy suggested we ask another question. Ask not what your country can do for you, but rather what you can do for your country. We've all heard that quote, but do we apply it to church? Do we Christians remember the motive for our gathering together? Now, this is something we would have heard very frequently when we were Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeah. We've all heard this quote from Hebrews chapter 10, 24 and 25, which goes, let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together as some have the purpose, etc. But notice the motivation here is not what do we get from church or gathering. So that the first question changes from what am I getting here to what am I bringing here?
Let me confess that when we came to Streetsville, this was not our attitude. But over that winter of 1992-93, our views underwent a rapid transformation. It was the study of Revelation, chapters 1 to 3, that completely overturned our what's in this for us attitude to the local church. The great Church of England scholar and Bishop of Dublin, C.Trench, knew something of church controversy himself, helping navigate the English church through the time of its greatest crisis, the massive defections to the Roman Catholic Church, and Darwin in the middle of the Victorian era, 150 years ago. Yet Trench, who also found, or is that made, time to become a major contributor to the first edition of the massive Oxford English Dictionary, wrote a famous commentary on Revelation's 7 churches. Here is his summation of these chapters, and this is a direct quote from Trench. For one who has undertaken the awful ministry of souls, I know almost nothing in Scripture so searching, no threatenings so alarming, no promises so comfortable as are some which these epistles contain. End of quote.
For Vivian and me, the study of Revelation 1 to 3 brought something into clear focus immediately. There was no perfect church, even in the first century, even under the apostles. Now this is a major problem among evangelicals, even as with cults. The myth of the pure church, nostalgia for a non-existent golden age when all was well with the Lord's people. Of Revelation's 7 churches at the end of the first century, 2 get Christ's undiluted praise, 2 get pass or borderline, but with ominous warnings, and 3 fail, 1 with seemingly no redeeming features. Yet as imperfect, heretical, or even, by conservative standards, apostate as these churches appear, and there's a quote from George Caird's commentary on Revelation. Caird says, "It is of the utmost importance for John's theology that the first statement he makes about the heavenly Christ is that he saw him among the lampstands. He is no absentee. He is present among the earthly congregations of his people."
John sees Christ walking among the lampstands of all 7 churches. Do we? Read about the 7 churches in Revelation chapters 2 and 3 and ask which description best fits your church. If you happen to attend the United Church of Canada, as we did from 1993 to 2013, you may find at least 4 with parallels to our situation. But much can be gained by examining the admonition to all 7. John Wesley, the father of Methodism, and you moved it before I finished reading, so I don't know what he said.
Therefore, the spiritual father of the United Church of Canada
Saw this clearly. And this is a quote from Wesley. There can be no state, either of any pastor, church, or single person, which has not here suitable instructions. All may draw hence necessary self-knowledge, reproof, commendation, warning, or confirmation.
Now Wesley had to wrestle with that question himself, because although he was an Anglican minister 250 years ago, he didn't desire to leave his Anglican church, but he was almost forced to leave by the politics of the day because he was so radical in his Anglicanism. So he becomes an exemplar for the rest of us, in that he didn't desire division in the church. He was almost forced to it by the fact that he was forced out of the Anglican pulpit. So that in that he becomes a model for the rest of us. It shouldn't be us that separate from each other. And according to the council of Christ of the seven churches, it is not an option to separate. Although the geography of the seven churches would have allowed you, theoretically anyway, to move your family to a church nearby, 100 or so miles away.
But culturally, it would not have been possible. People didn't move around like we do, all over the map.
No.
You know, it was, you were born in and lived in a place your whole life.
You dealt with it. So
Yeah.
you dealt with the spiritual geography of your church, and you had to do what you could do. So the council strengthened the things that remain should be operative for the rest of us, and we're of course spoiled for options today because of locomotion, because of rapid transportation. So the next segment we're going to attack the subject, the more personal subject, which is, why do you attend your church?